There's nothing left.
No.
Only the email, that's it. So I don't know what to do. I think you ring them and please. Send it. But I wasn't ready for that. But halfway through, after the hour, she said, oh no, this one was my essay. So I went through all the rigmarole and managed to get into it. And it wasn't that. I've done the dishes for got some money for it.
Looks okay. Looks wonderful. Yes.
So I did a few things and then unfortunately yeah, I think so. There's no better option. No options, but yeah, I would have thought the young lady in the wheelchair is here. Will have
I'll get it out.
which is all these folks that run stuff. These guys are retired, into it big time. Good evening.
Well done. And really? Are you sitting in the front?
You should sit here.
No.
Sure. Nobody
She can
else.
still
Yeah,
get
I'm sure she can. She's got a long Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to you. For those who haven't met me before, I'm Kim Bills, and I'll be emceeing this evening. We acknowledge the Kaurna people whose land we meet on this evening, and in fact any time we're here, and particularly note their elders past and present, their continuing spiritual connection to the land, and given that we've got a creek nearby, water, I guess, to some extent, and sky, some would say as well, but all of those wonderful things are part of acknowledgement and why we hope we can walk together with our Indigenous forebears into the future. This evening, if you're here to hear the Reverend Dr. Sarah Agnew speak on receiving the sacred story with imagination, rather than a meeting down in the corridor, then you're in the right place. And it's going to be very exciting. And I will not read out what's in the promo about what Sarah's actually going to do. But what I will do is just say a little bit more about her, because you don't all know her as those who come to this church do increasingly. So Sarah's been Minister of the Word here since August, just over 12 months ago. I mean, even more than that now, isn't it? It's going quickly. She was ordained as Minister of the Word in December 2010 into the Uniting Church in Australia. Her website, which is on the bottom of the promo sheet, should you need to remember, Sarah Agnew, Sarah with an H, agnew.com.au, and there you will find a whole treasure trove of things about Sarah and her various interests as a poet, a storyteller, a minister of the word, and more about jazz than I knew before. So when she says at the bottom of the promo that she enjoys jazz, being an aunt to two nephews and a niece, and forest bathing, and thus far I don't believe all three have happened simultaneously, but there's an opportunity there. Yes, so the jazz bit is something I didn't know myself, even though it's on the website. As a liturgist, Sarah is doing a lot of great stuff. So most recently, she helped write a large part of the liturgy for the General Secretary of the Uniting Church in Australia's commencement, if that's commissioning. Okay, that's good, commissioning. That's a word that they use in the Anglican Church as well. I could have used it, but I was sure it would be wrong. So that was very recently in Canberra. She's been rewriting hymns to make them, I will say, she would be more diplomatic, theologically more appropriate to the interests of a lot of people who come here. And so that's an ongoing project, and it's pretty exciting for those of us who get to sing them. Among other things, she's got books that are out in the foyer. One of them is based on her PhD thesis at Edinburgh University, called Embodied Performance. If you want an easy way into the book, not that there is particularly, it's a very substantial book because it was a PhD thesis. I've done a review of it in the PCNet website under book reviews. And there are a number of her other books out there too, which involve poetry and all sorts of other things. And I don't think I said she's also been published by Wild Goose Publications, which is something I didn't know before either. So I think that's probably enough to not hog Sarah's time. So without further ado, I mean, when I say enough, it gives you a small, eclectic palette of things about Sarah, and she'll now deliver much more than I could possibly have foreshadowed as she speaks to you tonight about receiving the sacred story with imagination, and be prepared, you won't just be spoken to. I should say, there will be at some points questions. We will adopt the procedure we did last time, which is the questioner will be selected by Sarah to come up to the microphone and have 30 seconds to put together a question or a quick comment. And if she's not brutal enough in cutting people off, if there's a very long thing happening, then I'll do so from not too far away. And at the very end, apart from welcoming you to stay on for tea and coffee and so forth, I will give you a heads up on next year's calendar program for the PC Forum. So thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Kim. The website is working now. It got broken, so I'm happy to send you off to the website. Yes. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak with you at this final gathering for the PC Forum this year. I know there have been some really rich conversations throughout the year, so I'm happy to have an opportunity to take part. Tonight, most of the time I'm going to spend is telling you a story rather than tell you how to use imagination. I'm going to show you. We will reflect a little bit at the end with what time we've got on some of the hows and whys of what I've done with an imaginative reception and interpretation of a biblical passage. Mostly I want to trust you to experience it and find your way. The story I'm going to tell is a story with 3 episodes. It's a story of the first days that Matthew joined Jesus, except that it's set today in Adelaide. The story's titled Reconnecting with Life, and it reimagines stories we find in the Gospel according to Matthew, in what we know as chapter 9. As storyteller Megan McKenna says, all stories are true. Some of them actually happened, and now this one is going to happen to you. As Jesus walked through Rundle Mall on a busy, warm, fine day, he saw a man called Matthew who was wearing a party cap and t-shirt and shoving how to vote cards under the nose of everyone who passed by. It was election season. Follow me. Jesus looked straight into his eyes and didn't say any more than that. Matthew gave his cap and how to vote cards to a fellow campaigner and followed Jesus. Later that day, Matthew was at dinner with Jesus and the inner group that he would come to know so well as Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, James and his brother John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, James bar Alphaeus, Thaddeus, the other Simon, and Judas. And then along with Jesus and these disciples, there were many others at this gathering. Others who, like Matthew, were part of the country's political machinations. Volunteers, staffers, politicians themselves. And Matthew recognised them as being involved in various levels of government and with varying affiliations, all here together. Dotted around, there were also some church leaders at the gathering. Identifiable, some of them, through their clothing, others their conversation, and again with various affiliations. Now, these church leaders were agreeing amongst themselves that, well, you know, the general population, well, they're not really sure how far they can trust those political folk over there. Folk who, it seems to many, promise much and then renege on most. if not all, their promises, who appear to forget all about the people they serve as soon as the power they have gained comes under threat. They were agreeing it's not particularly clear what Jesus is doing amongst such untrustworthy, manipulative, self-serving, power-hungry people. Surely rightness with God requires a measure of distance from such people. Now, Jesus happened to overhear when these church leaders were questioning Matthew, Philip and Bartholomew. What does he think he's doing? Why is your teacher at table with these folk? And before Matthew could defend himself and his fellow campaigners, Jesus' hand and glance at his disciples indicated, I've got this. His voice took on that teacherly quality that caused the hum of conversation to still. You know, those who are well don't have a need for their GP, do they? The way that those who are unwell do. I wonder if we might perhaps consider again Hosea's words from Holy One concerning a worshipful life. I desire mercy, not religion. And following the teaching of the prophets, I have come to call the ones, not the ones who are already right with Holy One. I've come to call those who are disconnected. As the hum of conversation picked up again in the absence of any further audible response from the church leaders, Matthew pondered what Jesus had said. I just answered Jesus' call. I got up from where I was and followed him without knowing him or questioning. Does that mean I somehow knew I'd been disconnected? How? And what from? Now I think about it, I seem to have decided to keep following this Jesus, even if he leaves Adelaide. Are all these people coming too? Will they stay connected if they return to the campaign trail? Or do people just go back to how things were before? Now, as if having overheard Matthew's internal dialogue, one of those party colleagues had moved across the room towards him and now observed, "Hey, we have a mutual friend from the party, I hear. She says you've just joined Jesus today." I've been to a few of these gatherings now, while he's been here in Adelaide. I travelled up to Clare as well, and down to Mount Gambier, and with him back up the Limestone Coast. I don't think I'm going to go on with the group next time he leaves Adelaide, though. But I think some of us here will keep gathering the things he said, revisiting the stories of God the way he tells them, with love, right? You know, it's completely changed the way that I've held myself when I go back to the campaign trail. Already, I'm more curious about the people I meet, what's going on for them, how our party is actually going to help them. Oh, sorry, that sounds a bit naff, doesn't it? Matthew insisted, no, not at all. Actually, thank you. I'd been wondering about those who choose to stay and why I think I might go. Oh, yes? How's your wondering progressing? Well, if what draws me is the igniting of the fire, it's been like that on campaign trails for years. I love lighting the spark. And then what draws others, maybe it's you perhaps, is keeping the fire alive where you are. Then, well, I guess each of us will be doing something more than we were before we met Jesus, as we connect to this holy story the way Jesus tells it, as you say. And that will keep us connected to him and to each other, won't it? As we tell that story and connect others to it. Now I'm sounding a bit naff. No, my new friend. You sound like you've got it. That mercy thing Jesus wants us to learn. If mercy is reaching out towards others because you care about them. Now, another day, Jesus had been in the shadow of festival theatre, talking with people on the grass by the torrens about different practices of prayer and fasting, when all of a sudden a bishop's assistant he'd met recently burst through the crowd and knelt before Jesus, almost weeping the words, my daughter, I am desperate. She's tearing the house apart, screaming. She's going to hurt herself again, and maybe us too, if you come and lay your hand on her. Surely you can calm the storm. Will you come? And Jesus immediately got up. And he and his disciples, and followed by the whole crowd, went with the bishop's assistant. When they arrived, a whole lot of concerned neighbours were starting to gather on the front lawn, drawn by the commotion inside. Someone had called the police, and the sirens and the lights added to the chaos as the crowd arrived with Jesus. Jesus stopped at the front steps and turned around and told everyone to go home. She's in pain. An audience is not going to help. And then they scoffed. Who's he to even tell the police what to do? Out. And Jesus entered the house. Inside, it was only him, parents and daughter still raging. It looked like she'd broken most of the crockery. Several windows were now letting the rain in, blinds pulled from their brackets and panes smashed, photo frames and pictures hung at strange angles on walls or left scars through the wallpaper where they'd been dragged from their hooks. The child had bleeding bare feet and arms. Tears and snot smeared her face, and was that potting soil? Jesus could see plant pots and plants in different corners of the room. And in the midst of all of that, Jesus stood, quite still. And slowly, this young teenager slowed her movements and came to stand quite still before him. She moved first, after what felt to her parents like hours, but was probably half a minute, leaning towards him in that wordless request, hold me. It was hours before Jesus rejoined the parents, sweeping up after the storm. How is she? Jesus didn't answer immediately, squatting to collect pieces of dinnerware. She isn't sure it is she, or if it is, she might be attracted to other she's. And the uncertainty, well, this. is the inner turmoil, uncontainable anymore. Not knowing how to speak the discomfort, or even what the discomfort is. The fear of disappointing or hurting those who love and are loved. If what does need speaking isn't something you want or are able to hear. But our story, surely... Fear isn't a power of rationality or reason. The fear, Jesus said, is part of the discomfort. Perhaps another cause of it. Oh, I shouldn't have taken on Bishop's assistant. There's no blame here. Yes, the whole family is on stage as you weren't before, and that has been one part of the angst. But I heard how you talked and prayed it through together, and I didn't hear regret for that decision. Eventually, the parents saw their child emerge from the front room and stood quite still, arms open in the universal invitation to come and be held. Now, if you know this story, you'll know there was another that day that Jesus met this family in their home who'd been ill for almost as long as this raging teenager had been alive, who had tried everything as life steadily eked away from her. This woman reached out to connect in desperation for life and felt Jesus reach back. Matthew looked at her when Jesus stopped and turned and looked at this woman no one would see in a crowd. Small, old, dark skin, dirty clothes, unkempt hair. If you did see, you'd quickly look away from one such as her. What was her story? Matthew wondered. What had made her reach out to touch his coat? Why had she not joined the queue earlier? In fact, Matthew was curious enough to stay when everyone else continued with Jesus towards that troubled teenager. Curious enough to want to listen to this woman's story. By now it had started to rain, so they hurried into a nearby cafe and he bought them both a drink and a plate of hot chips to share. How did you come to be here in the crowd, reaching out for Jesus today? I've been staying in a shelter in the city for some time. I'm not from the city. I'm from north of here, far north. But the doctors are all here. Someone at the shelter was telling everyone about this Jesus, that he was a healer. I've been to so many healers and doctors and therapists. I dismissed it at first. But this guy was so insistent that he'd gone with a friend to one of the gatherings, sure it was a scam, and while he sat there watching people approach Jesus with such trust, such faith, and being met by him with such, love was the only way he could describe it, without realising it, there he was, this guy, standing before Jesus himself, asking him for healing and believing it would happen. I've been so unwell. I don't go out in public much. It shames me how it dishevels me. But this guy's so enthused. He seemed to have felt the healing before he even talked to Jesus. Well, I thought maybe I don't actually have to see him. I don't have to look at him. He doesn't have to look at me. I could just get close. Maybe I could touch his coat or something, and that would be enough. Maybe I could finally know healing. I watched from the top of the steps, away from the crowd. And what I'd heard from this guy at the shelter, I could see for myself. The love that radiates from this man. I didn't know that was possible. Then something happened and you all got up and started leaving, and just when I decided to join the queue, risk the shame of being seen, and he was going. And my chance of healing? It was lucky there was such a crowd around him. He couldn't move very fast, so I could catch up. I don't move very fast, well, anyway, I didn't. Yeah, Matthew piped in. You moved quite quickly out of the rain there just now, didn't you? I haven't moved like that since I was 18. How long have you been unwell? 12 years. And so now I'm sorry, that's rude. No, it's okay. 18 plus 12. I'm 30. Matthew couldn't stifle his surprise. I know, I look double that. This illness has drained all the life out of me. Until today. Just now, today, I reconnected with life. I feel alive again. Will you tell him for me? Thank you. And thank you. This is the first proper conversation I have had with someone in such a long time. Someone who wanted to hear my story. Thank you, both of you, for stopping and for not looking away. Matthew couldn't reply. And he couldn't really see her very well either for a moment, with the tears welling in his eyes. This is why I followed him, he thought to himself. To reconnect with life. I'd like to leave a moment or two of silence to honour the story and invite you to honour how the story has happened to you. Now, pretty much every week, I have a choice before me. I can preach, or I can tell another story as a way of helping us receive the stories we inherit from our spiritual ancestors. As I studied storytelling, oral tradition, you can go back to the earliest orators, and every orator knows that what we make our listeners feel, you will remember long after anything I invite you to think. Why do you think the Bible's made up of so many stories? Because stories invite us to feel. So I've been playing with interpreting the stories we inherit in recent times by telling more stories. A big part of my job as a minister is to listen. to pay attention to our sacred inheritance, the stories we receive, and to the stories we are living, each of us and together as a community. And I've found that by telling more stories, I'm inviting us all to listen to the stories we inherit from our ancestors and to the stories we're living today. To let those stories move us to feel something, and by feeling, discover meaning for our living. Part of the process of interpreting, reimagining the stories in this way is to find the emotion in the story, to feel it, let it show me meaning, and then to communicate the story with feeling for you. Now that, it's really important to say, is not to manipulate a listening audience or congregation into feeling or finding what I think is the right interpretation. I tell stories, inherited and new, to invite you, as I said, to feel, to make your own connections, to discover meaning for yourselves. Now, this means that as an orator, I've got to trust you, my listeners. I need to trust you, and I need to know you. Storytelling is deeply pastoral. There's a relationship between every storyteller and her audience, or her listeners, or, in my case, mostly her congregation. An invitation to make meaning together as this story happens, embodied here, in this time, in this place. If you've been paying attention, you'll notice that emotion, audience, and our physical bodies are the three things I mentioned. Those are the three tools I use to interpret the biblical stories through what I have come to call embodied performance. And as Kim generously mentioned, I do have a book called Embodied Performance. It's out there in the hall. I also have a chapter in a forthcoming book called Tending to Stories, in which I do much of the thing I'm doing tonight in greater detail. I peek behind the curtain a bit more in that, with a story I told interpreting into a gap of Acts 16. Mostly tonight I've only got the time to trust you to have experienced the playful and faithful interpretation of a story by a story, as this telling of Matthew's stories has happened to you. If I do have a few moments, however, having made a brief case, I think, for why I do that, maybe I can pull back the curtain a little bit and show you a little bit of the how I just did what I just did. So I could give you an example of the emotion that I found in this inherited story, and that was the feeling of distrust that the people have, those other religious leaders have, of other guests at that gathering. Matthew's a tax collector, I think, when he's called, and the others at the dinner at that gathering are definitely, they're the tax collectors. They're distrusted. I've reimagined those dinner guests as those involved in the political scene. First century residents of occupied Jerusalem and Galilee distrusted those of their own people who collected taxes for the oppressors. Thinking about my audience today, who do we distrust in that real collective way? Well, the politicians are one obvious group, aren't they? That system seems a bit broken. I won't go off on that tangent. Now, I've just told you that information. I've told you around this information. This is the history and the socio-cultural context. But in the story I told, I showed you, right? The distrust. I showed you politicians. And hopefully you felt some of that sense of distrust that we collectively feel, and thus find some of the meaning that is in the story that we inherit, which we might not find because we feel a bit disconnected from what are tax collectors. In my embodied telling and interpretation of the story, I did invite you to critique the religious leaders, I hope, their hypocrisy and distrust. Surely you need some distance from those sorts of people. There's a distrust in our society, I have to confess, of religious leaders. Goes both ways. So listening to and knowing my audience, this story was originally composed for Pilgrim Uniting Church when I did a supply there earlier last year. I was wondering, how can this audience hear this story again for the first time? Not only have Christians been hearing it for 2,000 years, but those Christians have been hearing it for their lifetime, many of them. How about we bridge the gap between us and them, between now and then, by putting Jesus in our midst here, in Adelaide, especially for a city church like Pilgrim. Let's put Jesus on their doorstep. You may have noticed I didn't give you the gender of the bishop's assistant or the girl's other parent. I didn't even give you the gender of the bishop. I didn't have the girl dying, but there are matters of life and death. Is the female gender she's born with about to be shed? Is the inner turmoil causing such pain as to threaten her life? Pilgrim, along with many other parts of the Uniting Church, is a congregation that welcomes families and individuals in these very situations. What does healing look like for them? And in the second healing story, I deliberately suggest, rather than explicitly describe the ethnicity of the brown-skinned woman from the north. Is she a First Nations person? Is she of a migrant family or refugee family who've been relocated to a rural location? You see, women in first century times would have been instantly overlooked and dismissed, regardless of the illness, because they were women. That might not be quite so the case today, although we could debate that. But we live in a majority white society, and people of colour most certainly are dismissed because they are simply a person of colour. So, in telling her story, giving her another attribute, I've helped us, I hope, to see it's not only her illness that ostracises this woman back then, this brown person of colour now. So imagination, emotion and bodies, and the relationship between listeners and teller, between teller, listeners and the story. These are the tools I use to playfully, faithfully interpret our inherited sacred stories. And I encourage you to have a play if you don't already. Thank you. Have a breath. That was a lot, potentially. Are there any questions or comments, pushbacks? Want me to say more about something? Yeah, come forward.
Okay, I come here quite regularly, but I should perhaps introduce myself more formally. My name is Grant Agnew. I'm a brother and companion of the Grand Lodge of South Australia and the Northern Territory. I belong to a lodge, which is a research lodge, to find where Freemasons are going to go in the 21st century. And I am the chaplain. And one of the things that we found over 20 odd years of asking Freemasons and Freemasons' sons and I speak also for the ladies who are Freemasons. I don't know if you realise that there's actually a separate women's lodge, but they are less obvious, but I know them and we can speak for them, where they wanted to go with Freemasonry. And one of the suggestions was that our dry, rather clerical-like presentations of our secrets, and which are really just moral plays from very similar to Shakespearean plays, was that they wanted the performances to be more performed. And so much of what you show today is what we've been experimenting with in our special lodge. We use lights. We try and get hold of some real swords from the reenactment societies and just bring that... and exactly what you spoke about, the thought is if they get an experience, that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. And not only will they understand some of the moral principles or ethic principles we're trying to teach, but that also will draw them back to attend more regularly and just have that general talk over our festive board, which is what we have here, equivalent here, just to get them through the problems of life. So that's one aspect. I'll sit down, but I might like to come back.
Thank you. That's really wonderful to hear. Yeah. So I think in the broader community, storytelling as an art form is being remembered. What sets humans apart from all other creatures is that we are storied beings. And so it's innate. It's part of us, you know, telling someone at home what happened on the way home, what happened at work. We tell stories. It's how we make meaning. To do so with intent and purpose, particularly for, you know, the ritual stories, the sacred stories, for the stories that tell us the deep stuff of life, whether it's Shakespeare, Austen, or, you know, the plays we get in the festival and the Fringe. Storytelling tells us who we are and helps us to live. Kim?
This is not a Dorothy Dix, but I was very pleased that you, at the end, talked about the ethics and the trust, because I was reminded of J.D. Vance and eating the cats and dogs. And he said, well, it may not be factual, but it's true, and it helps people to understand the truth. That's just a comment.
All stories are true.
Still the same Grant Jackway, but I've only been back in Adelaide for 7 years, and I've spoken to you about this before. When I lived in Brisbane, I got an opportunity to serve in a mission church, and that's the Indooroopilly Uniting Church, and I think we've got some previous members of Indooroopilly Uniting here sometimes. And so when I came back to Adelaide, they suggested come back to Pilgrim, and our mission was to people. We had one of those, I think they're called Blue Dog or something like that, mental health services, and I generally work with refugees, but we also had people in gender crisis and that kind of thing. So they sent me back to Pilgrim, and I attended church with the group of people you're speaking of. And when you were presenting on that thing, I was struck by. I have an interest in gay theology, so I was struck then that you actually you presented a bit like it was an AIDS support group, and I thought how relevant, and you know, and we all understand some of the traumas that American politicians are suffering when they have to hide or disclose their sexuality, and I thought that covered it very well, and makes you think about that. You know, Jesus was a chaplain to many different lifestyles. And I really felt that, and I thought that was a wonderful idea, because there's also a subtle way of introducing it, because I know even in this even in this area, I'm always hesitant to start discussing gay theology because you have to sort of know your audience. But so thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Great to hear the connections you were making. Yes, Mum. I'll, disclose that that's... Marnie, welcome.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Marnie Agnew, and she's my daughter, and I'm very proud of her. That story of the woman who touched Jesus' cloak is very dear to me, as Sarah will know. Years ago, over 20 years ago, we joined the Australian Network of Biblical Storytellers. And at one of the gatherings, I told the story of the woman who touched Jesus' cloak, because for me it was a story of redemption, of restoration of self-respect for someone who'd been ostracised and made to feel worthless. Because I'd had a child who, not Sarah, who didn't sleep for her first 12 months. And at the end of it, I was an absolute mess. And when I finally found a doctor who knew what was happening and could fix it, it was like restoring my self-respect. And so for me, that story of the woman who, because I'd had doctors tell me that, aren't you, well, we walk the floor with our children, aren't you, our babies, aren't you being unrealistic in not expecting to do the same with yours? And there's nothing wrong with this child except its neurotic mother. And finally, the doctor who found it, who knew what was going on, because he had two children who'd had exactly the same problem, which was basically an intolerance of milk protein, and he fixed her in a week. And the first thing he said to me was, "What do you think is going on? Because you spend more time with her than anybody else." And that was what restored my self-respect. And for me, when Jesus turned to that woman and held out his hand and touched her, because she'd been ostracised and not been allowed to touch anybody, not even her own family, that was a time of redemption for her and of restoration of her self-respect. And that's why that story really resonates with me. And thank you for doing it tonight, as you did.
Thanks, Mum. Heather will wait for just 2 seconds. You can come up, I'm not going to take long. There's something about the way that I chose to tell that story that puts some of that restorative seeing and looking, not just in the hands of Jesus, but in his disciples, right? And that invitation to transformation and, healing is not, in my version of the story, it's not only the woman who is transformed, it's Matthew into someone who can see and can heal. Yeah, thanks, Mum. Heather, sorry.
Actually, that segues in quite nicely. So the bit that you told about Matthew sitting down with the woman in the cafe, chips between them, I thought really brought the storyteller, Matthew, into the frame so strongly, because when we read old words, we read the content and sometimes forget the vessel who's brought it to us, in this case, Matthew and others who have gathered information and brought it to us today. And putting one of the gatherers of that information back into view is rather powerful, don't you think? I was wondering how we can find ways to just get a glimpse of those who have brought that to us, because we're looking at it through their lens.
Thank you. I don't know that I was consciously aware that I was doing that intentionally. So as you're noticing that, I'm wondering then what I bring to that process of reimagining the story, because every time we tell the story, whether it's as we've received it or reimagined, we are interpreting it, we are mediating it through ourselves. So the point is not to get out of the way entirely, it's to actually, what am I going to do with that? What do I helpfully bring as a lens that helps us to see it in a particular way? So what I bring is I am a storyteller, and I am working with the Network of Biblical Storytellers. I'm part of the International Scholars Seminar that's part of that network. So I've got them in my foreground, haven't I, right? So just by instinct and practice, he's the one I want to tell the story through, I guess. Yeah, thank you for noticing that. I love how when I tell a story, even that I've composed, somebody else will show me something I hadn't seen. It's brilliant. Stories are amazing. Have I said that already? Stories are amazing.
My dear old dad has been dead for 52 years, I think. And when I go back and think about him, many pleasant memories come back. But most pervasive are the jokes he told. And most of them are corny old jokes, but I can still remember them. Not word by word, but I can remember the punchline and how you get to it. To what extent can you inject humour into the stories? I mean, I can imagine you telling a story about Nicodemus, the guy that came to Jesus by night, and making him into a complete clown. That would be a hilarious story. But is that an effective way of drawing people in?
Thank you. I forget if I think it's David Rhodes who, when he talks about his methodology as a performer-interpreter, humour is in there. It's one of his top things as a part of the method for telling biblical stories. He would argue that, especially in Jesus' stories and stories about Jesus, humour is everywhere. So I don't know that I would go as far as him, but yes, humour is there. And so, you know, the kind of the wry sort of, you don't want to be associating with those people. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I'll get it in there somehow, usually. Lots of storytellers will know that even in the harder stories to tell, a moment of lightness gives you a moment to pause and to take things in. So that's a key strategy in the oral storytelling practice. There's another person in the Network of Biblical Storytellers, Richard Swanson, who has a project called Provoking the Gospel. He's got a website. He's got commentaries on all four Gospels. He's a good friend, and his project when he was doing this with drama students at Augustana University in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, was to get the acting students on stage and literally provoke it and play with it. And they would take the Nicodemus one and push him as far as they could as a clown. Even beyond what is within the boundaries. So when you're interpreting stories with a storytelling approach, you're opening yourself up to the multiple possible truths that are in a story and the multiple possible ways we can tell it. That's not to say that there are no boundaries at all. There are definitely boundaries in all of the biblical stories as to what will feel true and what won't, when we've pushed it too far, when we've overlaid ourselves too much onto the story. Richard's project would deliberately push beyond that because in that space, they knew what they were doing. They were experimenting, they weren't performing for anyone else. But it would show you when you transgress a boundary, you find out where the boundary is for a start, and it also shows you something about what is true. That's not true. You know, Nicodemus, maybe you find Nicodemus isn't a complete clown. Maybe he's more sympathetic than that. But if you push far into it, you can find some truth in it. So I think, yes, absolutely humour. And I think in various ways and contexts, it'll have its strengths and weaknesses, right? As with anything. But I think I do wonder if we take too much of the humour out. I could get on a soapbox now, but there's a way of receiving the biblical stories that is overly pious, and it puts the, like, the reader will have this intonating, very, very, in Matthew, followed Jesus immediately. Really? Wasn't it more astonishing than that? So there's that, and then there's, well, we can't use humour, we can't laugh. That's sacrilegious. No. Yes, we can. Oh, yes, we can. Humour, play, it is faithful. It does have integrity, and it does have its place in receiving and interpreting the Bible. Absolutely. Thank you. Does this need to be the last one? Kim?
No, it can be
Okay.
one after this.
Okay.
Should there be?
For me, one of the qualities of a really good storyteller is that you get drawn into the story. And all I wanted to share with you was that when we were hearing about the brown-skinned woman and Matthew sitting in the cafe listening to her, I was in that cafe having a coffee and listening into the story.
Amazing. I hope nobody imagined her in that cafe with Matthew all cleaned up. She's still unkempt, right? Yeah. Yep. Yep. I think that might be a good place to pause the conversation and hand back to Kim. Thank you so much for engaging and listening and showing me where those stories took you. Thanks.
Absolutely. So I didn't really say enough about storytelling in the intro, but I don't think I needed to, did I? You've seen it, felt it, heard it, all of that. So thank you very much, Sarah. That was great. And those of you who haven't heard Sarah before, well, we're very lucky to have her here. So next year, before we go to have a break, for those who can stay through those doors, looks like I'm up first next year. The topic is one we brainstormed. It probably looks like a camel, doesn't it? How can we live in a time of polycrisis and hyperconnectivity?
We need storytelling on that one.
However, there is a subtitle, which may or may not be adequate. Insights from Brian McLaren, who's written a book relevant to this in particular, and systems thinking, which is something that I want to inject into it. Anyway, that's first up, 6th of February, so it's still the first Thursday of the month, same time, same station. We haven't quite filled all of the slots for next year. There's one that's not quite filled yet, but I'll just take you quickly through the others, and fairly soon the program will come out. So on the 6th of March, Fergus McGinlay, who's at the back, you probably all know him, doing the AV stuff for us. He's got a book being launched, The God Who Doesn't Exist. And we'll have a reviewer, some Q&A, something around that on the 6th of March. 3rd of April, Greg McDonald, who's just done a PhD here, talking about what does it take for Christians and Muslims to talk together. And he's very sympathetic about that talking together. The 1st of May, Anne Butler, how do we deal with the reality of death? There may be a subtitle to that as well, but when some of us are getting older, and so it's important to think and talk about these things. 5th of June, Tom Price, what might we Christians learn from the Baha'i faith? I don't know what the answer is, but I'm interested. The 3rd of July, Fuzz and Carolyn Kitto are coming over from Sydney, and the question for that session is, why is modern slavery relevant in Australia, and how can we help combat it? On the 7th of August, now that we know that Sarah is going to do a pretty good job, we've actually got a panel session to talk about what do liturgy and worship look like from a progressive perspective. And Marion Millen, who's in the audience, will be on that panel, and there'll be one other who is not confirmed yet, so I won't hint at that. 4th of September, we think we know the speaker, we don't know the topic. Hopefully we'll hear more about that after tomorrow. 2nd of October, Rick Sarr, who's a fine lawyer who's been here before, talking about something like, is liberal democracy necessary for freedom of faith to survive? Now, there's a lot of autocrats in the world. There's a lot of democracies under threat. I don't know what Rick's going to say, but I think it's going to be an interesting topic. David McDougall, who's joined our task force this year, is going to talk about, do we need to rethink forgiveness? Not sure where he'll go with that, but it's... And then the final session for next year on the 4th of December is Deirdre Palmer, and her topic is making meaning a continuing task? So I hope that's whetted your appetite. And with that, thank you all for coming. Please stay if you're able, and we'll adjourn to the room just through the curtains, which hopefully will cool down. Thank you.